They laughed at him and told him to move, said he didn't belong there. But the next morning, he walked through the same doors as the new owner. He had no home, no car, no name they cared to know. But that didn't matter because by dawn, he would own the place that rejected him. It all started on a cold and quiet night. The kind where the city lights shimmered off wet pavement and laughter echoed from warm, comfortable places. Outside the grand doors of the Regency Pearl Hotel, a man sat, his coat torn, his shoes mismatched, his face shadowed beneath a tattered hood. He looked like he didn't belong anywhere, the kind of man people stepped around without ever looking down. His name was Malcolm, though no one there cared enough to ask. The Regency Pearl wasn't just a hotel. It was a monument of luxury. Glass chandeliers, marble floors, and a valet line filled with imported cars. The staff carried themselves with practiced grace, smiles sharpened for the wealthy, and eyes blind to the forgotten. But that night, the staff noticed Malcolm because he had chosen their doorstep to rest on. He had come there with a small, weathered duffel bag and a faded blanket that had seen too many winters. He laid it down near the edge of the grand staircase, as if he were claiming a piece of ground that no one else wanted. Inside, through the crystal doors, the receptionist frowned. Her name was Clara, a woman who measured people by their clothes and their credit cards. She called the security guard over, whispering sharply. To her, Malcolm was a stain on perfection, a shadow that didn't match the golden glow of the lobby. Outside, the man sat still. He wasn't begging, wasn't moving, wasn't bothering anyone. He simply watched. The cars, the people, the laughter that spilled out whenever the heavy doors opened. His eyes didn't show anger, just a tired patience, like someone waiting for a moment that hadn't yet arrived. As the night stretched on, guests began to notice him too. Some chuckled, some shook their heads, some pulled their coats tighter as if poverty were contagious. The whispers started, the laughter followed. Can you believe he's just sitting there? One guest murmured as he handed his keys to the valet. Security came out twice that night. They told Malcolm he couldn't stay there, that this was private property. He nodded politely, each time, then moved a few feet away to the sidewalk. He said nothing. The cold crept in, and the wind picked up. But he stayed. A few of the younger staff thought it was funny. They took pictures from behind their lobby glass, posting them with captions about the city's new doorman. One bellboy even mimicked the way Malcolm sat, slouched and motionless, earning a round of laughter from his co-workers. They never noticed the quiet dignity in the way the man held himself. They never noticed the calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who already knows the outcome, even when everyone else doesn't. Morning came, and the golden sunrise spilled across the hotel's marble entrance. The night manager switched shifts, shaking his head at the sight of the man still there. He muttered about calling the police next time. But before anyone could move him, Malcolm stood up. He brushed the dust from his coat, folded the worn blanket with deliberate care, and reached into his duffel bag. He pulled out a pair of shoes, not new, but clean, and slipped them on. Then, from the same bag, he took out a neatly pressed suit jacket. It was plain dark, but carried an air of quiet strength. No one paid much attention until he walked up the steps, the same steps he had sat beside all night. He didn't hesitate. He walked through the golden doors like he belonged there. Clara's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to tell security to stop him, but something in his stride made her pause. The man who had seemed invisible now walked with purpose, head high, eyes steady. She forced a smile, confused. Sir, may I help you? He simply looked around, scanning the lobby, the chandeliers, the staff, the same people who had mocked him hours before. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. From behind him, the valet whispered, That's him. That's the homeless guy. But then another man entered the lobby, tall, wearing a grey suit, holding a folder with the hotel's logo. He smiled warmly at Malcolm, shaking his hand with both of his. The entire lobby froze. The stranger handed Malcolm a document, and the homeless man everyone had laughed at unfolded it carefully. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Purchase Agreement Regency Pearl Hotel. The pen moved smoothly in his hand, as if it had done this many times before. He signed the papers while the staff stared speechless. When he finished, he turned back to the stunned crowd. The man who had slept on their sidewalk was now the owner of the building they stood in. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked around, his eyes settling on the marble floor where he'd sat all night. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The staff looked down, ashamed. The laughter from the night before echoed in their heads, suddenly heavy and cruel. And in that quiet lobby, the story of the homeless man they laughed at had only just begun. Because what they didn't know was that Malcolm hadn't come to buy a hotel just to own it. He had come to teach them a lesson that would change every single one of their lives forever. And as the morning sun rose higher, the city outside continued as usual, unaware that inside the grand doors of the Regency Pearl, pride, power, and perception were about to collide in ways no one could have imagined. The man they mocked had risen, and his next move would shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about him. When the truth settled into the walls of the Regency Pearl Hotel, silence followed. The kind of silence that doesn't ask questions, it just stares. The staff who had mocked the man hours ago now stood behind polished desks and crystal counters, faces pale, hands frozen mid-motion. Malcolm, the man who had once sat on their sidewalk, now stood in the center of their marble kingdom, holding the papers that proved it was all his. His posture had changed. He wasn't hunched or weary anymore. There was weight in his stillness, a calm command in the way he looked around. The man beside him, the one who brought the documents, was Mr. Dean Carrington, a senior executive from a real estate group the hotel had been quietly negotiating with for months. They had been told the buyer wished to remain anonymous until the final day. None of them expected this man, the one they had laughed at through glass doors, to be the face behind the money. But he was, and he wasn't done. Mr. Carrington congratulated Malcolm again and departed, leaving the new owner surrounded by the same staff who once wanted to call the police on him. He didn't speak for a while. He just walked, slowly, deliberately. He examined the hotel not as a stranger, but as someone reclaiming something that had always been his. He ran his hand along the mahogany rail, the polished brass of the elevator, the framed portraits of the hotel's founders. His expression didn't reveal pride, just quiet remembrance. The employees followed him with uneasy eyes. Every step he took made them smaller, made their laughter echo louder in their memories. Clara, the receptionist, was the first to find her voice. She straightened her blazer, forcing a smile that trembled at the corners. But her words came out thin and nervous. Malcolm didn't look at her. He simply walked past the front desk and stopped before the massive glass doors, the same ones he'd watched from outside all night. For a long moment, he stood there, staring out at the street. It was as though he was seeing both sides at once, the warmth of the inside and the cold he'd once endured on the other side. And then, slowly, he turned back. His eyes swept across the lobby, across every person who had seen him and chosen not to see him. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. Behind him, a housekeeper whispered to another, asking who he really was. The story spread fast. Some said he must have won the lottery. Others thought he was a scammer. But the truth, the real truth, was stranger and far deeper than any of them could guess. Because years ago, Malcolm hadn't been homeless. He had once been a successful investor, CEO founder of a property firm that had helped rebuild neighborhoods across the city. He'd been known for helping the very people most had forgotten, the poor, the struggling, the overlooked. But betrayal has a way of changing everything. A business partner he trusted had stolen everything. The accounts, the properties, the reputation. One false accusation, one forged signature, and Malcolm lost it all: his company, his home, even his name. For months, he disappeared from the city's glossy business circles. People assumed he had fled, that he'd cracked under the pressure. But he hadn't. He stayed close, quietly observing, rebuilding from the shadows. And now, years later, he stood again in the same city that had watched him fall, inside the most prestigious hotel it had to offer, not as a guest, but as the owner. The staff didn't know this history. All they saw was a man who had gone from sidewalk to suite overnight. But for Malcolm, this wasn't just a purchase. It was a resurrection. Later that morning, the board of directors of the hotel arrived, summoned unexpectedly. They had sold the property at a bargain price, assuming the anonymous buyer was a private equity firm. They never imagined it was the same man their own security cameras had captured sitting outside. When they met him in the executive office, the one overlooking the skyline, their polite smiles faltered. The former chairman, a man named Richard Gable, looked at Malcolm with disbelief. He had once turned Malcolm down for a partnership deal years ago, dismissing him as too idealistic for serious business. Now, he sat across from him as an employee of his former reject. Malcolm listened quietly as they discussed transitional management, operations, and finances. He nodded, said little, and signed what needed signing. His pen strokes were steady, his silence deliberate. He wasn't interested in power for power's sake. He was interested in what came next. When the meeting ended, he dismissed them courteously. Then, he walked back down to the lobby, the same lobby that had once turned its eyes away from him. Outside, the morning traffic had begun to hum. Tourists walked past, unaware of the quiet storm inside. Clara and the rest of the front desk crew stood at attention. The atmosphere was different, now heavy with guilt and uncertainty. Some couldn't even meet his gaze. Malcolm stopped in front of the concierge desk, where the bellboy who had mocked him stood fidgeting with his gloves. The boy's laughter from the night before replayed in his head like a bad dream. And still, Malcolm said nothing. He simply placed a card on the counter, black, embossed with gold lettering. On it were 3 words that would soon define everything that followed. The Pearl Initiative. Then he turned and walked away. The staff exchanged confused glances. None of them knew what it meant, but by evening they would, because by then Malcolm's true intentions for the hotel would start to unfold, and they had nothing to do with luxury or wealth or image. He had bought the Regency Pearl not to live in it, not to profit from it, but to rebuild it into something that would strip away the vanity it stood for. The lesson he carried had been forged in pain, and soon everyone under that roof would learn what it meant to see through someone's worth, and still miss the truth. As the sun set behind the glass towers of the city, Malcolm stood by his new window, looking down at the same street where he had once slept. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from the night before, but now it seemed distant, hollow. He had returned not for revenge, but for revelation, and by tomorrow morning, the entire hotel, every guest, every worker, every manager, would discover that the man they once saw as worthless had come to give them something far more valuable than money could ever buy. By the next morning, the whispers had spread beyond the marble walls of the Regency Pearl. Every staff member knew the new owner's name now. Malcolm Weller, the homeless man who had sat outside their door 2 nights ago, was the same man who now signed their paychecks. But with that revelation came something even stranger, a wave of rumors, questions and fears. What kind of owner doesn't speak? What kind of man buys a luxury hotel without saying what he wants from it? And what was the Pearl Initiative that his black and gold card hinted at? No one knew yet, but they were about to find out. When dawn broke, a memo appeared in every department's inbox. It was brief, no signature, no long message, just a simple notice. All staff meeting at M sharp, attendance mandatory, MW, at exactly 9. The employees gathered in the grand ballroom, the same room that hosted the city's elite just days earlier. The chandeliers glimmered as dozens of nervous faces filled the seats. Housekeepers, bellboys, clerks, chefs, everyone was there. Then the doors opened. Malcolm walked in, dressed in a dark grey suit, calm and composed. He didn't speak right away. He simply walked to the center of the room, looked at the faces before him, some curious, some ashamed, some afraid, and nodded once. Then he began to speak. His voice was deep, measured, carrying the kind of quiet weight that draws every ear in the room. He told them who he was, not just the man they saw on the sidewalk, but the man he used to be, the investor who had once helped rebuild communities, the one who had lost everything through betrayal and greed. He told them he hadn't come back to flaunt wealth or settle scores. He had come to rebuild something else, character. And that was when he revealed what the Pearl Initiative really was. It wasn't a new luxury brand, nor a rebranding strategy. It was a transformation project that would turn the Regency Pearl into something the city had never seen before. A hotel that gave back. Under the Pearl Initiative, part of the hotel's operations would become a training and rehabilitation program for the homeless, the jobless, and the formerly incarcerated, giving them skills, housing, and employment. The very people the world dismissed as hopeless would now be given a second chance inside the same walls that once rejected them. The room went silent. Some of the employees looked stunned. Others frowned, unsure what it meant for them. Malcolm continued. He explained that every department, from housekeeping to front desk management, would include trainees from local shelters and rehabilitation centers. They would work alongside the current staff, learn hospitality, management, and financial literacy. A portion of the hotel's profits would go directly into community programs, funding job placements, and affordable housing. But there was one more thing. Malcolm said that every current employee would have the opportunity to mentor these new hires, not to command them, not to look down on them, but to teach and learn together. Because compassion, he said, was a skill to one that this place had forgotten long ago. The silence that followed wasn't just surprise, it was reflection. The same people who had laughed at a homeless man were now being asked to guide others like him. Some were humbled, some were uncomfortable. Clara, the receptionist, sat near the front. The weight of her actions still pressed heavy on her. She remembered her laughter, her whispered complaints, the look on Malcolm's face when security told him to move. Now she couldn't meet his eyes. The bellboy, the one who had mocked him the most, felt his throat tighten. He had thought the man would fire him the moment he got power. Instead, Malcolm was offering him a chance to become something better. After the meeting, Malcolm didn't linger. He simply thanked them for their time and left. But his words stayed behind, echoing through the corridors, bouncing off the marble and glass. Sometimes you must lose everything to remember what truly matters. By afternoon, reporters had caught wind of the story. News outlets lined the street outside, their cameras flashing, their voices rising. Homeless man buys luxury hotel, turns it into social project. The headlines spread like wildfire. The city's elite couldn't believe it. Some mocked it as a stunt. Others called it inspiring. But for the people living in shelters across town, hope began to flicker. Within days, applications flooded in. Dozens of men and women, people just like Malcolm once was, showed up at the hotel, clutching resumes written on crumpled paper, faces full of both shame and hope. And true to his word, Malcolm welcomed them. He walked among them, shaking hands, listening to their stories. Many were scared, afraid of being turned away again, but his voice, steady and warm, told them otherwise. He set up training programs in the lower conference rooms. He brought in volunteers from community colleges to teach hospitality skills. He partnered with local non-profits to provide counseling and uniforms. The Pearl Initiative was coming alive slowly, beautifully. But not everyone was happy about it. Some long-time employees began to complain quietly. They said it wasn't fair, that the hotel's image would suffer, that the guests wouldn't want to stay somewhere that employed those kinds of people. The whispers of discontent began to stir again behind Malcolm's back, just like before. But this time he knew, because Malcolm wasn't naive. He understood that changing buildings was easy, changing hearts was not. Late one evening, as he walked through the quiet halls, he overheard two staff members talking near the elevator. Their words stuck, but he didn't interrupt. He just kept walking, remembering how those same words had once been said about him. He returned to his office overlooking the city, where the lights shimmered like scattered stars. He looked down at the street where he had once slept, and whispered to himself that the real battle had only just begun. For every person he helped, there would be someone else clinging to their prejudice, their pride, their comfort. But he was ready, because this wasn't just about a hotel anymore. It was about redemption for himself, and for everyone who had forgotten what humanity looked like. The Pearl Initiative was no longer just an idea. It was a movement. And as the first group of new trainees prepared to begin work the next morning, none of them, not even Malcolm, knew how deeply their presence would change the soul of their Regency Pearl forever. Change rarely arrives to applause. It comes quietly, unsettling the comfortable, forcing everyone to see what they've been pretending not to. That was exactly what began happening inside the Regency Pearl Hotel. In just a few weeks, the Pearl Initiative had transformed the building's rhythm. The lobby, once echoing with rehearsed politeness and luxury for the elite, now carried a different kind of energy, one that felt raw, human, alive. New faces appeared behind the counters in the kitchens and along the hallways. Men and women who had once lived in shelters now stood in crisp uniforms, learning to serve, to manage, to build new lives. The marble floors they used to sweep as janitors now led them to careers they had never imagined possible. But not everyone celebrated this new beginning. Whispers began to grow again, sharp, cold, and full of resentment. Some long-time employees thought the hotel was losing its prestige. They grumbled about image, about standards, about how this wasn't what they signed up for. Behind closed doors, they complained that Malcolm's vision was idealistic, that he didn't understand real business. To them, compassion didn't fit on a balance sheet. Even some of the guests began to notice the changes, and not all of them approved. A few made quiet complaints to management about being served by inexperienced staff. Others avoided tipping trainees whose hands still trembled from nerves, or who didn't yet know how to mask the scent of poverty that still clung faintly to their clothes. Malcolm heard every complaint, and yet he didn't react with anger. He knew what they couldn't yet see, that transformation always looks like chaos before it looks like progress. But one morning, things took a darker turn. An anonymous email circulated through the staff, mocking the new hires, calling them beggars in uniform. It was cruel, written with poison dressed as humor. When Malcolm read it, he recognized the tone immediately. It was the same mockery he'd felt that first night on the sidewalk. He didn't respond publicly. Instead, he called a quiet meeting with the department heads. He told them that the Pearl Initiative would continue stronger than before. And to make that clear, he announced that 2 of the trainees would now join the front desk rotation, the very place where he had once been shunned. Clara, the receptionist, felt her stomach twist when she heard the news. It wasn't pride or anger, it was guilt. She had been part of that mockery once, And though she now worked harder than ever, she couldn't forget. She began helping the new trainees personally, teaching them how to check guests in, how to handle difficult situations, how to carry themselves with confidence. Slowly, her heart began to change. She saw pieces of herself in them, her own fear, her own hunger to belong. One trainee in particular caught Malcolm's attention. His name was Devon, a tall young man with a quiet strength and a scar along his jawline. He had been homeless for 2 years after leaving foster care. Now, under the initiative, he was learning hospitality management. Malcolm saw himself in Devon, the same resilience, the same pain buried under calm eyes. He made sure Devon got opportunities to grow. But this decision would soon ignite the resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface. One afternoon, as Devon worked the front desk, a wealthy guest recognized him. The man had once been a regular at a downtown shelter, the same place where Devon had stayed. Instead of showing kindness, the guest made a scene, accusing the hotel of lowering its standards. The lobby went quiet. Staff froze. Devon stood still, humiliated but composed. Malcolm arrived moments later. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood beside Devon, his presence enough to silence the whispers. The guest left soon after, red-faced with shame. That night, Malcolm reviewed the security footage alone. He didn't do it out of anger, but to remind himself why he had started all this. Every act of cruelty reminded him of how much work was still left to do. The next morning, he addressed the staff again. He told them that kindness wasn't a policy, it was a choice, one that tested who they really were when no one was watching. He didn't name names, didn't punish. He simply reminded them that everyone, once in their lives, has stood outside some door waiting for someone to let them in. Slowly, the tension began to shift. Clara started spending her breaks with the trainees, listening to their stories. The bellboy who had mocked Malcolm began teaching one of the men from the shelter how to polish shoes properly. Even some of the older employees began to soften, realizing they had been given a chance to rewrite their own character too. But while hearts were changing inside, something darker brewed outside. News of the hotel's transformation had reached competitors and investors who once held shares in the property. Some accused Malcolm of ruining a brand. Others spread rumors that he was using the initiative for tax breaks or publicity. Then came the real blow. A formal complaint was filed by the hotel owners association claiming that the Regency Pearl's new model devalued the neighboring properties and disrupted the image of luxury hospitality. It was a coded attack, dressed in legal language. But Malcolm knew what it meant. They didn't want his kind of hotel in their world. For the first time since buying the Pearl, Malcolm felt the weight of resistance pressing hard against him. His board warned him that lawsuits could follow. Some investors began to withdraw their support. But he didn't waver. He had lost everything once. He had lived in the cold, eaten from trash bins, and been invisible in a city that only saw suits and status. What could they possibly take from him now that he hadn't already lost? That night, as he walked through the quiet lobby, he saw Devon cleaning the counter, the same spot where Malcolm had once stood in shame. Their eyes met for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. The shared understanding of struggle, and the fire that comes from surviving it. Malcolm returned to his office and stared out the window at the glittering skyline. The city looked beautiful from up high, but he knew what it looked like from the ground, too. He whispered a promise to himself. No matter what came next, the lawsuits, the ridicule, the financial storms, the Pearl Initiative would not fall, because it wasn't built on marble or money. It was built on purpose. The world had laughed when he sat outside their doors. Now it feared what would happen if more people like him started walking through them. And as the rain began to fall outside, washing the streets clean, Malcolm felt something deep inside him shift, a resolve turning to steel. Tomorrow, he would face the city. Tomorrow, he would fight for every forgotten soul who still slept in the cold. The man they laughed at was not finished. He was just beginning. The storm that hit the Regency Pearl wasn't of rain or thunder, but of doubt and scrutiny. What had begun as a local miracle, the homeless man who bought the hotel, had now become a headline the city debated. Some called him a visionary. Others called him reckless. Reporters circled the building like vultures. Investors withdrew, and the city's elite quietly distanced themselves. The lawsuits came, just as predicted. Claims that the Pearl Initiative was disruptive, unprofessional, and misaligned with industry standards. Every word was coated in the same arrogance Malcolm had faced his whole life. It was no longer about money. It was about control. Who got to decide what success looked like? Who got to decide who was worthy? For a few days, even the strongest among his staff began to lose faith. The whispers of failure crept back into the marble halls. Guests cancelled bookings, corporate contracts froze, and the Grand Hotel stood on the edge of collapse. But through it all, Malcolm remained still, calm, steady. He had learned long ago that when the world turns against you, silence can be the loudest response. He kept the doors open, even when profits fell. He continued training new workers, even when others told him to stop. He paid wages from his own dwindling funds, refusing to let the lights go out. And then, something unexpected happened. One morning, a letter arrived not from a lawyer or a banker, but from a woman whose son had recently completed the Pearl Initiative program. She wrote that her boy had been living on the streets for 5 years, lost to addiction and hopelessness. But after being hired at the hotel, he found purpose again. He was saving money, taking classes, smiling for the first time in years. She ended her letter with a single line that stopped Malcolm cold. "You didn't just save my son, you reminded me he was never lost." He folded the letter gently and placed it on his desk. It was small, simple, but heavier than all the lawsuits combined. Because in that moment, Malcolm understood the Pearl Initiative had already succeeded. Not in the way the world measured success, but in the way that truly mattered. Still, the fight wasn't over. A week later, Malcolm was summoned to a public hearing downtown. The city council had called it to review the viability of his project. The boardroom was full of reporters, hot lights, expensive suits, and skeptical faces. They questioned him for hours about finances, safety, reputation, about why he thought mixing luxury clientele with unstable populations could ever work. He answered every question calmly. He told them about the people he'd met, the lives rebuilt, the guests who had written letters thanking the hotel for showing them the meaning of hospitality again. When one official mocked the idea of a 5-star hotel for the homeless, Malcolm looked him in the eye and said quietly, not as defense, but as truth, that dignity didn't belong to one class. It was a universal right, and this hotel was proof of that. When he finished, the room was silent. Not everyone agreed. Some still rolled their eyes, whispered about financial losses, about how long his experiment could last. But others quietly, slowly began to see something they hadn't before. They saw a man who had once been invisible stand in front of power and refuse to bow. The hearing ended without a verdict. But outside, something was already shifting. The story spread again, not the scandal, not the lawsuits, but the truth. Social media lit up with testimonies from former trainees who now had jobs, homes, and families. Guests who had stayed at the hotel began sharing their experiences online about how the service felt different, warmer, more human. What had started as ridicule turned into admiration. The same newspapers that once mocked him now called him the man redefining luxury. Within months, bookings rose again. The lawsuits quietly disappeared. Investors who had withdrawn came back, this time asking to be part of the mission they had once doubted. But Malcolm didn't let fame touch him. He stayed the same, humble, watchful, and grounded. He still visited the shelters once a week, speaking to those who were where he once had been. He never told them his story directly. He didn't have to. His presence was proof enough. Inside the Regency Pearl, life blossomed. The staff worked side by side, no longer divided by class, but united by purpose. Clara, once the cold receptionist, was now head of guest relations, known for her warmth and mentorship. The bellboy who had mocked Malcolm was now managing the valet department, training others with patience and respect. And Devon, the young man with the scar, had risen faster than anyone. His leadership, his kindness, his quiet confidence inspired everyone around him. One evening, he knocked on Malcolm's office door to deliver the final report for the quarter, showing profit, stability, and growth. Malcolm smiled as he read the numbers. But what mattered to him most wasn't on the paper. It was in the faces of everyone he saw each day, people who had been broken, now whole again. That night, after everyone left, Malcolm walked out into the cool evening air. The city buzzed with life. Across the street, he saw a familiar sight, a man sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket, shivering in the cold. For a long moment, Malcolm stood still, watching. Then he crossed the street quietly and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just handed him a small envelope. Inside it, the card of the Pearl Initiative and a note that read, "Come by in the morning. We'll find you a place." As he walked back toward the glowing lights of the hotel, a gentle rain began to fall, the same kind that had once soaked him years ago. But this time, he wasn't shivering. He paused at the steps, looking up at the golden letters above the doors, the Regency Pearl. He smiled faintly, not out of pride, but gratitude. Because now, this place, once a monument of exclusion, had become a symbol of grace. The same doors that had once been closed to him were now open to everyone. He stepped inside, greeted by laughter from the staff, warmth spilling through the air. And in that moment, the story came full circle. The man they had laughed at no longer needed validation. He had already won, not by owning a hotel, but by owning his purpose. And as the night deepened, the lights of the Regency Pearl burned softly against the skyline, a quiet beacon in a city that had learned, at last, that greatness isn't about wealth, or status, or titles. It's about how you treat those the world refuses to see. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black Says, where every story reminds you that life can change in just one moment.